The question of whether women possess individuality is one of the most provocative and troubling subjects ever raised in modern philosophy. Otto Weininger, in his 1903 work Sex and Character, constructed an argument that women, by their very nature, lack true individuality. His reasoning combined elements of psychology, biology, and metaphysics, producing a worldview that has been condemned for its misogyny, yet studied for its historical influence. To understand his argument, one must begin with the foundations of how Weininger defined individuality. For Weininger, individuality did not mean the everyday uniqueness of personality traits or preferences. It was not a matter of different tastes in music, appearance, or lifestyle. Individuality, in his philosophy, was tied to the highest expressions of the human spirit: morality, reason, and creativity. To be an individual meant to be capable of transcending instinct, resisting conformity, and producing works or actions that bore the unique mark of one's inner essence. An individual was, in this sense, not just a separate person, but a spiritual being capable of freedom and genius. He contrasted this with what he saw as the species character, a species being lives not for itself, but for the continuation of the collective. It is bound by natural instinct, reproduction, and cycles that repeat endlessly without originality. In Weininger's framework, woman belonged primarily to the species, while man was capable of stepping outside of it. This distinction formed the core of his claim that women lack individuality. Women, according to him, were bound to reproduction, sexuality, and relational existence. Their lives were determined by biology and by the natural roles of mother, lover, or caretaker. Their psychology was inseparable from instinct, leaving no room for the detachment required for morality or intellectual creation. Man, in contrast, could resist instinct, abstract from nature, and stand as a free, rational agent. In his ideal form, man was capable of genius, the production of philosophy, science, and art that bore his singular signature and could transform history. Weininger believed that this difference was not merely cultural or historical, but metaphysical. Woman was, in his words, without ego. She did not possess a stable, enduring self that could rise above circumstances. Instead, she was entirely relational, defined by her connection to others, whether as daughter, wife, or mother. Her identity was absorbed into roles, never existing independently as a fully autonomous being. For this reason, he denied her individuality in the higher philosophical sense. Underlying this conclusion were two characteristics that he saw as essential to womanhood: amorality and sexuality. He argued that women lacked a true moral compass, that they were incapable of separating themselves from immediate desires and instincts. Where man could struggle with moral choices and rise above them, woman was immersed in impulse, without the distance required to judge or restrain it. This supposed amorality, he said, was not a conscious failing, but a structural limitation of her nature. Sexuality was, in his argument, the second and even more defining element of woman's being. For him, woman was inseparable from her sexual function. She was always bound to her role in reproduction and attraction, never standing apart from it. Everything about her character, he insisted, was colored by her relation to sexuality, from vanity and coquetry to nurturing and maternal instincts. Because she could never transcend this tie, she could never establish herself as an independent ego, free from the species. It followed from this reasoning that women were incapable of genius. Genius, in Weininger's philosophy, was the ultimate mark of individuality, the power to create something eternal that bore the unique stamp of the self. He looked at history and concluded that no woman had produced works of enduring genius in philosophy, mathematics, or the highest forms of art. To him, this absence was not an accident of social conditions, but proof of an inherent limitation. Woman could inspire genius in men through love or attraction, but she could not produce it herself because she lacked the individuality required for its creation. This logic, grim and deterministic, reveals why Weininger declared that women lack individuality. He saw them not as persons in the fullest sense, but as manifestations of the species, bound by amorality and sexuality, incapable of moral freedom or creative transcendence. In his system, the individual was defined by separation from nature, and woman was defined by immersion in it. The extremity of this view shocked readers in his own time. Vienna, at the turn of the 20th century, was a hub of psychoanalysis, philosophy, and artistic innovation. Freud was developing his theories of sexuality, Wittgenstein was preparing to enter philosophy, and the arts were breaking away from tradition. In this atmosphere, Weininger's sex and character appeared as both a product of its time and an attack on it. It echoed certain prejudices of the age, such as the belief in inherent gender hierarchies, but it pushed them to a philosophical extreme that few dared to articulate so openly. What makes Weininger's claim even more striking is that it was tied to his personal struggle. He was a young man torn between ideals of purity and his own sense of unworthiness. His disdain for sexuality, his suspicion of women, and his pursuit of individuality were not abstract theories alone, but reflections of his own inner torment. Only months after publishing his book, he took his own life, leaving behind a philosophy that was inseparable from tragedy. Part of the fascination with his work lies in this contradiction. On the one hand, his philosophy denies individuality to half of humanity. On the other, it raises a profound and universal question: what does it mean to be an individual at all? If individuality requires freedom from instinct, if it demands the creation of something that outlives one's own biological existence, then perhaps very few people, male or female, truly achieve it. By exaggerating the supposed difference between man and woman, Weininger forced his readers to ask whether individuality itself is a rare achievement rather than a universal possession. This, then, is the foundation of the argument that women lack individuality in Weininger's philosophy. It rests on his definition of individuality as moral autonomy and genius, on his portrayal of women as bound to sexuality and immorality, and on his belief that history itself confirmed his theory. It is a philosophy shaped by prejudice and personal despair, but also one that left a lasting mark on the intellectual history of Europe. To understand more fully why Weininger believed women lack individuality, one must look closely at his distinction between the masculine and feminine principles. He did not merely describe men and women as separate biological categories, but instead argued that every person is a mixture of these two metaphysical essences. Masculinity, for him, was the principle of reason, morality, and individuality, while femininity was the principle of instinct, amorality, and absorption in the species. No one, he said, was purely male or purely female, each human being carried both principles to varying degrees. Yet in his system, the balance was decisive, and the predominance of the feminine principle in actual women led him to claim that they lacked individuality. This framework allowed him to speak not only about physical sex, but also about spiritual essence. Masculinity was not identical with having a male body, nor femininity with having a female one. Instead, they were archetypes that shaped character, intellect, and destiny. A man who was dominated by the feminine principle would, in Weininger's view, fail to achieve individuality and sink into the life of instinct. A woman who carried a spark of masculinity might rise above her sex, but only at the cost of renouncing her nature. Thus, his philosophy reduced individuality to a masculine possession, and womanhood itself became synonymous with its absence. For Weininger, the masculine principle was creative, producing something new that could never be reduced to the cycle of nature. This is why he linked it with genius. A truly masculine spirit, whether in a man or in a rare, exceptional woman, created works that transcended biology and time. The feminine principle, in contrast, could not produce but only repeat. It was tied to continuity, reproduction, and the endless cycle of life. This distinction between creativity and repetition, between transcendence and immanence, was central to his argument. He used this framework to explain why women, in his account, lacked morality. Morality required the ability to see oneself as a separate being, to judge one's own instincts and choose against them. The masculine principle, representing reason and self-awareness, made this possible. The feminine principle, immersed in instinct, could not generate such detachment. A woman, in his claim, could act kindly, but it would not be out of moral struggle or principle. It would be the expression of natural inclination, maternal instinct, or desire for approval. Morality in the true sense, the weighing of good and evil, and the sacrifice of desire to principle, was reserved for the masculine. This supposed amorality was one of the most controversial aspects of his philosophy. He believed women could not commit evil in the full sense, because evil itself required moral awareness. Instead, they were simply natural beings acting according to impulse. In this way, he denied women both responsibility for their actions and credit for moral greatness. They existed, in his philosophy, outside the realm of ethical struggle, and thus outside the realm of individuality. His treatment of sexuality extended this point. For Weininger, the feminine principle was always defined by sexuality. A woman was never just a person, but always a sexual being, tied to her body, her appearance, and her reproductive role. Vanity, coquetry, and even maternal devotion were, in his theory, all expressions of this underlying sexuality. A man dominated by the masculine principle could transcend sexuality, turning his energies toward thought, art, or invention. A woman could not. Her individuality, if she could be said to have any, was always consumed by her sexual nature. This argument led him to a harsh conclusion about women's intellectual capacity. He denied that women were capable of producing original philosophy, mathematics, or art. When he looked at history, he found male figures who had transformed the world with their genius, but could name no women of comparable stature. To him, this absence was not an accident of social restriction, but proof of natural incapacity. Women, he said, might imitate or perform, but never create. At best, they could serve as muses, inspiring male genius through love, but they could not themselves embody individuality. The masculine and feminine principles also explained his views on love. He argued that women loved not individuals but types. A woman did not fall in love with a particular man because of his unique individuality, but rather because he represented masculinity, power, or social status. Her love was instinctual and generic, always bound to the species. A man, however, could love a woman as an individual, seeing in her qualities that transcended her sex. This asymmetry reinforced his belief that only men could truly appreciate individuality because only they could recognize it in others. Critics of Weininger have often pointed out that his arguments reflect the cultural anxieties of his time more than universal truths. At the turn of the 20th century, the women's movement was gaining momentum in Europe. Demands for education, political rights, and social participation challenged traditional roles. For many men, this produced fear that the boundaries between masculinity and femininity were dissolving. Weininger's philosophy, by defining individuality as exclusively masculine, reasserted those boundaries in the most radical way possible. By denying individuality to women, he reinforced the hierarchy that placed men as bearers of culture and women as servants of nature. Yet even within his own system, contradictions appear. If masculinity and femininity are principles that exist in every individual, then it should be possible for some women to possess individuality if the masculine principle dominates within them. Weininger allowed this in theory, but immediately dismissed it in practice, claiming such women were exceedingly rare and essentially unnatural. In this way, his framework was rigid. Any evidence of female individuality could be explained away as an exception that proved the rule. This part of his argument also reveals the personal dimension of his philosophy. Weininger was obsessed with purity, self-control, and the pursuit of genius. He saw sexuality as a threat to individuality, a force that pulled men down into instinct and weakness. His suspicion of women was therefore tied to his suspicion of sexuality itself. By identifying woman with sexuality, he externalized his inner conflict, turning his struggle with desire into a condemnation of half of humanity. His philosophy was not only a theoretical system, but also a reflection of his personal anxieties. What remains striking is that Weininger's theory gave individuality such a lofty definition that very few people could meet it. If individuality means moral autonomy, creative genius, and freedom from instinct, then perhaps most men also fall short. In condemning women as lacking individuality, he set a standard that excluded the majority of humanity, including, by his own admission, parts of himself. This raises the deeper question of whether individuality, as he defined it, is a rare ideal rather than a common reality. When Weininger turned his attention to the traits he believed defined women in everyday life, he focused on deception, imitation, and dependence. These qualities, in his philosophy, followed naturally from the feminine principle and reinforced his central claim that women lack individuality. If individuality required a stable ego, a capacity for truth, and an ability to stand apart from the crowd, then qualities such as imitation and dependence marked the absence of individuality. He regarded these traits not as accidental flaws, but as inevitable consequences of woman's immersion in sexuality and instinct. Deception was, for Weininger, inseparable from woman's nature. He argued that woman's life was always tied to appearance, to presenting herself in a way that would secure love, attention, or approval. Makeup, fashion, charm, and coquettish behavior were not superficial acts but expressions of a deeper lack of selfhood. Because she did not possess a firm inner ego, woman needed to construct an external image through which others would define her. This reliance on appearance meant that woman was bound to deception, not necessarily in the deliberate sense of lying, but in the structural sense of never presenting a true inner self. In his eyes, there was no stable self to reveal, only masks worn for social survival. From this argument, he concluded that women could not be truthful in the deepest sense. Truth required independence of thought and a willingness to stand alone against the world. It required a commitment to principles higher than social approval or personal advantage. Woman, lacking a stable individuality, could not achieve such detachment. Her truthfulness, he claimed, was always relative, always bound to circumstance and relationship. In this way, Weininger equated femininity with untruth, not as a conscious fault, but as a condition of existence. Imitation was the second trait he emphasized. Weininger observed that women often adopted the ideas, tastes, and opinions of men around them. Rather than generating original thoughts or creations, they repeated and echoed what had already been established. He argued that this imitative quality was another expression of the absence of individuality. An individual created, resisted, and innovated. A being without individuality copied, conformed, and adapted. Women, in his account, were excellent imitators but poor originators, capable of reproducing music or art with skill, but incapable of inventing new forms. This emphasis on imitation extended into his interpretation of women's intellectual life. He suggested that women who entered philosophy or science were usually reflecting the ideas of men, rarely producing independent insights. Even when they appeared brilliant, their brilliance was derivative, a mirror rather than a source. This criticism was tied to his broader view that women lacked genius. Genius, for him, was originality, the power to give birth to something wholly new. Imitation was therefore its opposite, and he used this contrast to reinforce his claim that women could not achieve individuality. Dependence formed the third pillar of his critique. He argued that women were constitutionally unable to exist as autonomous beings. Their sense of identity was always tied to others, whether as daughters defined by fathers, wives defined by husbands, or mothers defined by children. A man could exist for himself, he believed, but a woman could only exist through her relationships. Her life lacked an inner center and therefore required an external anchor. This dependence was not only emotional but also intellectual and moral. She needed guidance, approval, and direction from others because she lacked the inner compass of individuality. Love, in Weininger's philosophy, revealed this dependence most clearly. A woman did not love a man as an individual, but as a representative of masculinity. Her devotion was instinctual, directed not at the uniqueness of a person, but at the type he embodied. This kind of love, he argued, was less about genuine recognition of individuality and more about survival within the species. It reinforced his belief that women lacked the ability to appreciate individuality even in others, since they could not recognize it within themselves. Critics have often pointed out that these claims were built on circular reasoning. Weininger began with the assumption that women lacked individuality and then interpreted every trait in that light. If a woman displayed charm, he called it deception. If she agreed with others, he called it imitation. If she sought connection, he called it dependence. What could be understood as social adaptation or relational strength, he interpreted as proof of deficiency. His theory thus filtered all evidence through a predetermined lens, ensuring that no counterexample could emerge. Historical context helps explain why these ideas gained attention. At the dawn of the 20th century, women in Europe were entering universities, participating in public debate, and demanding political rights. Traditional roles were being challenged, and many men feared the breakdown of established gender hierarchies. Weininger's philosophy gave intellectual weight to these anxieties by presenting them as metaphysical truths, by arguing that women's dependence and imitation were natural and unavoidable. He provided justification for excluding them from intellectual and political life. At the same time, some readers saw in his work not merely a condemnation of women, but a warning to men. If dependence, imitation, and deception were tied to the feminine principle, then men who succumbed to these traits were failing in their individuality. His book could be read as a call for men to resist the feminine within themselves, to strive for independence, originality, and truthfulness. In this sense, his philosophy was not only misogynistic, but also ascetic, demanding an almost impossible standard of masculine purity. Yet the more one studies his reasoning, the more fragile it appears. If individuality is defined as independence, originality, and truth, then very few human beings achieve it. Men, as much as women, often imitate, depend, and deceive. Social life itself requires compromise, conformity, and adaptation. To accuse women uniquely of lacking individuality is to ignore the universality of these traits. Weininger set the bar for individuality so high that nearly everyone fails to reach it. But then he singled out women as incapable of ever approaching it. This contradiction reveals the tension at the heart of his philosophy. He wanted to preserve the ideal of genius, morality, and freedom from instinct. Yet he could not reconcile it with the reality of ordinary human life. By attributing failure to one half of humanity, he preserved the dream of individuality for the other half, even if only a few men would ever achieve it. His attack on women, therefore, concealed a deeper despair about human limitation itself. Weininger's emphasis on deception, imitation, and dependence may have reflected less about women in general and more about his own fear of losing individuality. He dreaded being swallowed by instinct, conformity, and desire. By projecting these fears onto women, he created an enemy that embodied everything he wished to overcome in himself. His critique of women thus functioned as a mirror of his own inner struggle, transforming personal anxiety into philosophical doctrine. The consequences of Weininger's philosophy extend beyond his immediate arguments about women and reach into broader questions about individuality, morality, and the purpose of human life. His claim that women lack individuality provoked outrage, fascination, and reflection, because it touched on one of the most sensitive areas of modern thought, the relation between gender and the highest human ideals. By reducing individuality to a masculine possession, he excluded half of humanity from philosophy, morality, and genius. Yet by defining individuality in such lofty terms, he also suggested that it might be an exceptional achievement rather than a common inheritance. This paradox has shaped the reception of his ideas for more than a century. The first consequence was social. His book appeared at a time when the women's movement was gaining ground in Europe. Calls for suffrage, access to higher education, and participation in professional life were challenging the assumption that women were destined only for domestic roles. By denying women individuality, Weininger gave philosophical justification for their exclusion from these domains. If women were incapable of moral autonomy or intellectual originality, then it seemed natural to deny them rights and opportunities. His work was seized upon by those who feared change, reinforcing prejudices that sought to preserve traditional hierarchies. At the same time, the extremity of his claims sparked strong reactions. Feminist thinkers of his era pointed out that his arguments confused social conditions with inherent incapacity. Women had been denied access to education, artistic training, and political influence for centuries. Their absence from the ranks of recognized geniuses could be explained by structural barriers rather than metaphysical deficiency. To attribute their position to nature rather than culture was to excuse oppression rather than explain reality. Critics argued that individuality is not a masculine monopoly, but a human potential stifled by unequal opportunities. Another consequence was philosophical. Weininger's definition of individuality as moral autonomy and genius raised profound questions. If individuality is the capacity to transcend instinct, to act from principle, and to create something enduring, then perhaps very few people achieve it, regardless of sex. In this sense, his philosophy draws attention to the rarity of true individuality. Most people live by habit, imitation, and instinct. They conform to social norms and pursue biological drives without creating anything original. By setting the bar so high, Weininger inadvertently exposed the difficulty of individuality for all humanity, not just for women. His misogyny concealed a broader, existential despair about the limitations of human life. There is also a psychological dimension to the consequences of his philosophy. Weininger himself was a young man tormented by inner conflict. He struggled with sexuality, purity, and self-worth, and he projected these struggles into a universal system. His disdain for women reflected his own fear of desire, his suspicion of instinct, and his longing for transcendence. By equating woman with sexuality, dependence, and deception, he externalized his inner anxieties. The fact that he ended his life shortly after publishing his book suggests that his philosophy was inseparable from personal torment. In this light, his denial of female individuality appears less as an objective analysis and more as a cry of despair from a man unable to reconcile spirit and body, reason and instinct, self and species. Later thinkers wrestled with his legacy in different ways. Some, particularly in the early 20th century, admired his uncompromising pursuit of ideals even while rejecting his conclusions about women. Others dismissed him as a tragic figure whose philosophy reflected more about his pathology than about reality. Feminist philosophers returned to his work as an example of how deeply misogyny can be woven into supposedly rational systems. By deconstructing his arguments, they sought to show how cultural prejudice masquerades as metaphysics. His philosophy thus became not only a statement of ideas, but also a case study in the dangers of projecting personal conflict into universal claims. The most enduring consequence, however, is the question he raised about individuality itself. Is individuality truly the essence of humanity, or is it a rare gift reserved for a few? If individuality means autonomy, originality, and moral struggle, then it demands a level of freedom and creativity that most people may never attain. In this sense, Weininger's philosophy challenges us to ask whether individuality is a universal potential or a difficult ideal. Even if one rejects his exclusion of women, one might still recognize that individuality, as he defined it, is a fragile achievement requiring great effort and rare circumstances. This leads to a re-interpretation of his most controversial claim. Instead of asking whether women lack individuality, one might ask whether humanity as a whole often lacks it. Most lives are consumed by instinct, repetition, dependence, and imitation. The pursuit of individuality, whether by men or women, requires resistance to these forces. It requires the courage to stand apart, to act from principle, and to create something that bears the unique mark of the self. In this sense, the challenge of individuality confronts all people, not just women. Weininger's error was to assign this limitation exclusively to women rather than to humanity as a whole. Another dimension of the consequences lies in cultural history. Weininger's work influenced writers, philosophers, and even political figures in ways both constructive and destructive. Some admired his radical seriousness, others used his arguments to justify misogyny, and still others saw in his tragic life a warning about the dangers of absolutism. His book continued to be read and debated long after his death, not because people agreed with his conclusions, but because his questions could not easily be ignored. By denying individuality to women, he forced readers to think about what individuality meant, how it could be recognized, and whether it truly was attainable. Ultimately, the legacy of his philosophy reveals the complexity of the concept of individuality. If individuality is tied to genius, then it is indeed rare. If it is tied to moral autonomy, then it is a demanding task that requires constant vigilance. If it is tied to freedom from instinct, then it may always be under threat from the forces of biology and society. The tragedy of Weininger is that he recognized these difficulties, but sought to resolve them by excluding women rather than confronting the shared limitations of humanity. His philosophy is thus both a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and a reminder of the enduring struggle to define and achieve individuality. The claim that women lack individuality cannot stand as a universal truth. It is rooted in cultural bias, personal anxiety, and flawed reasoning. Yet the challenge of individuality, the demand to rise above instinct and create something eternal, remains. In facing this challenge, men and women alike confront the same struggle, one that defines the human condition itself. Weininger's mistake was to place the burden of failure on women alone, but his questions about individuality continue to resonate because they touch the core of what it means to be human.